O God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, you, God, who has brought us this far, you who by your might have led us into great paths of power and great postures of resistance and a rebellious imagination on the side of good that allows us to believe that justice is possible, that allows us to believe that a sustainable, workable economy is possible, that there is no need in our world for winners and losers, but we all have a share in the power, the richness, the sheer greatness that we often ascribe to this nation. We enter into this space ready to be enriched, ready to be propelled, ready to be compelled to do the work of justice. For that is what the prophet says that you require of us, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with you. And so may these moments, the wisdom of our guests, may their tenacity, may their clarity be the kind of spark we need to go where we've never gone as people who believe in the power of co-governance, that we don't just send people to Trenton, we don't just send people to Washington, but we expect that they govern according to the will of their voters, the will of the people, the will of the common good. It is in the name of this good, the name of abolition, the name of freedom, that we pray this prayer. Amen. I'm so excited that we have today three distinguished guests who have life stories that I do want to hear a bit about today. Grateful that we have Tiffani Torres, who is a native of Brooklyn. You're from BK, a native of Brooklyn, New York. I spent some time in Harlem, but got mad love for Brooklyn. Grateful for Tiffany. Tiffany is now a student at Georgetown University in the nation's capital, and she's a young adult activist who took on the segregative machine of New York City, and is one who consistently makes de Blasio live up to his own rules and his own words. And so we're grateful to have Tiffany with us today, who represents a newer generation of activists. We're grateful to have Brother James G., a Morehouse man. Always delighted to be in the presence of my elder Morehouse brothers. He is one that we can say is an accomplished political strategist. He served as the chief of staff for one of my favorite legislators, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, and there's so much that we can say about his political imagination and the way that he makes and helps us to think about calculations for building Black power and realizing the power of Black votes here in New Jersey. And then we have someone who's a favorite of Building One America, but also of Mount Zion. This is her second time being with us in about a month. We have Michelle Burris, who is a graduate of Spelman College. So we got Morehouse here, we have Spelman here. Of course, we got Georgetown here. Mad love for Georgetown, no question about it. But my Spelman sister is with us today. She is a fellow at the Century Foundation, and she has spent much of her career, which is still an early career, thinking about secession, thinking about ending segregation, and thinking about racial and economic justice as matters of policy. And so to the three of you, welcome to Mount Zion. Welcome to Building One America. I want to start this conversation by allowing you all to introduce yourselves more intimately, more fully. It is my understanding that you all come into this work not simply out of political and not simply out of professional ambitions or trajectory, but these trajectories were set by certain forms of lived experience, whether those were early in those formative years as high school students, as children in homes, or or in the early parts of your college life or your professional life. So James, Brother G, we'll start with you. What really invited you into the work that you do now?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Always a pleasure to be with you. I actually, it's kind of relevant. My political work and involvement all came from my church. I was a member of Shiloh Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey, where the pastor was S. Howard Woodson growing up, who was Morehouse man and who was the Speaker of the House in 1973. He was the first Black Speaker of the House for a state legislator in America. And he was my pastor. And then by the time I came along, he had retired from politics, and he put in his place in that assembly seat, Mr. John S. Watson. And I became friends with Mr. Watson and was somewhat of his mentee. And I worked with him from the time I was in the sixth grade until I graduated high school. I worked in his office every summer. And that's Bonnie Watson Coleman's father. And so he literally introduced me to politics. He made me know that politics was not, so to me, the way it was introduced to me, that it was a service industry and it was an extension of the civil rights movement. And what we were doing was about trying to find access and resources for our community. And so I really thank God for my entree into politics in that way, because it frames everything that I do, because the guy that brought me in in a way that was service-based. And so I never got the commercialized version of that we're in politics to make money or to make somebody rich we were actually, Mr. Watson's philosophy was that Black people are preoccupied with survival, and it's your job to interpret for them that which they don't have time to interpret for themselves, and to fight for them because they have to raise kids and make a living and struggle and fight against racism. And while they're doing that, you should be fighting to make sure that the rules are fair and the playing is level. And so that has been, that influenced me then, and it still remained what I do going on. And I ended up running his daughter for Congress, working there for about 7.5 years as chief of staff. But I've always been a campaign guy. When I count up how many campaigns I've done exactly 50 campaigns over the course of my career. And so as a Hill staffer, I always tell people I was a campaign guy masquerading as a Hill staffer. And so everything that I did, everything I do is through the eyes of how we get more of us elected. And when I say us, those people who are a fan of righteousness and fairness. So.
Welcome again, Brother G. Welcome again. Tiffany, how'd you enter into this work?
Hi. So I kind of entered based off of just experiences I had within education and especially during high school. I was a part of this program called SEO Scholars, and their tagline is that they bridge the achievement gap between high achieving Black and Latino students and more affluent upper class white students in the city. And that even joining and applying to the program was something that struck me, because when I was in elementary and middle school, I moved around a few times. So the second school that I moved to, they were, I think, a few weeks behind what I was learning in the school that I was in previously. And then it happened again, and when I moved from to my next middle school. So it's basically every time that I changed schools, I was kind of relearning. And they were schools that had the same had basically the same demographic and income background. So it wasn't I was changing where I was really low, but aside from borough, I wasn't really changing what type of school I went to. It was just there was just always a shift that kind of made me realize not every school is the same. But I didn't think anything of it until I got to high school and I applied to SEO because they kind of drill into you that okay, you're high achieving, you can make it out if we help you. And I never really liked, I knew the purpose of the program, and I know their messaging is well intended, but I always wondered why is there a need for SEO in the first place? And it's great that this program exists for the 200 students that they accept every year, but do we even need a program like SEO in the first place? And so I started to think about that, like in my time going to, because even in addition to like regular classes I was taking, SEO's Saturday class, they also make you go attend extra classes for 2 hours after school once a week. And then you also have half of your summer is gone because you also have to attend like summer academy from 8:30 to 4:30 every single day. And so they kind of like, I knew that there were a lot of friends that I had that like didn't have that experience, and they didn't understand that or they didn't know that the education that they were receiving wasn't up to par. Because like you go to school in your area and you think that you're receiving the same level of education as everyone else. Like that's how New York City education is advertised as open choice, but you don't realize that that's not necessarily the case, especially at Georgetown. Like that's something that hit me when I started college. But through SEO, I always wondered, like, why is there a program like SEO? Like why is it that like my school isn't as good as a school that is in the Upper East Side? And I didn't know like how to address the problem. Like I didn't know what to do. I just figured if people are already working on it, then like what can I do as a sophomore in the city? And then one of my friends actually presented about Teens Take Charge, which is what I spent the majority of like my last 2 years of high school participating in, and how I got involved. It's basically, for those that don't know, a student-led organization that focuses on like developing policies and public advocacy to try and ensure equity in New York City public high schools specifically, because we couldn't really focus on all levels of schooling because elementary and middle schools are kind of like based on zoning and residential areas, but high schools were easier to target because students apply to high schools outside of their borough usually. And so long story short, I joined Teens Take Charge and immediately my life changed. I started to realize that there were actually things that students could do and a pressure that we could apply that adults didn't necessarily apply because they're not a part of the system. And we didn't need to have a filter because people forgave us a lot for what we said. They kind of had to listen, unlike a lot of like parent advocacy organizations and like just other organizations that were also trying to do the work at the time. I feel like it was a unique organization that like all of our public actions and everything that we kind of like advocated for got so big in such a short amount of time because people kind of had to listen to us. And then it got to the point where people wanted to listen to us. And that's when I realized that like, okay, our words have merit and like our experiences have merit, and we need to do what we can to make sure that like people understand what's wrong with the system, like what's wrong with our education, what's wrong with what's happening now, and like how we can fix it. So that's kind of how like I got involved in high school.
No, thank you, Tiffany, so much. In high school, thank you so much. Michelle, how'd you get?
Yes, I'd like to begin by saying good evening to everyone. Thank you, Pastor Francois, for the opportunity, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to almost do a combination of what James and Tiffany laid out. I've got here as a combination of family, education, and faith. I'll start with education. So the factor of education was that when I went to middle school, my parents wanted me to go to a high school, but that high school tended to not be in my neighborhood, nor be near any zip code that I lived in. So that means that my parents had to make great sacrifices for me to be able to attain a great education. For me, that meant commuting an hour and a half one way to go to a quality high school that my parents thought that I would have a great opportunity. As I commuted to this high school, I was still young at the time and around ninth grade, but I wondered how come I couldn't go to my neighborhood high school, and how come those same opportunities were not offered to the same students that looked like me right up the street from me. As I matriculated through high school, I also wondered about the trajectory of outcomes. How would my life have changed if I was not able to have gone to that high school? And in the words of the actress Viola Davis, the difference between myself and other women of color and students of color is just opportunity. I was afforded an opportunity to go to a magnet high school, but many students who look like me were not. And because of that education, beginning from high school, that laid out a trajectory for me to be able to go to school at Spelman and then to go into the Peace Corps, where I served in Rwanda for 2 years. I was the first Black volunteer that most of my students had ever seen. I had encountered being called the N-word. Many of my students, we did not have electricity sometimes. Most times we never had running water, but to see the zeal that they had for education. Some of my students walked 2 miles in the sun down a mountain just to come to school. And that made me reflect on the opportunities that we have here in America and how none of those can be taken for granted. All of that education really came as a result of the family, of family values. I was blessed to have grandparents throughout most of my life, up until almost 30 years old now of age, who really instilled in me what it means to be a servant leader. I had a grandmother who worked for Dr. Fauci, who didn't get her master's until her 50s, but had a zeal for me to seek education and to always put the service of others first. And so my family embodied what it truly means to be a servant leader. And that goes back to faith. You know, we all, no matter what our faith, we all have a belief that to whom much is given, much is required. And so I believe that as a servant leader, it is my duty and my obligation to bring other students of color with me, particularly Black students, and ensure that they have the same opportunities that I was so blessed to be afforded. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. James, you've spent a lot of your life in investing in what it means to build political power as an extension of those civil rights gains, as an extension of capturing, in many ways, recapturing the gains of the civil rights movement. If we consider, Shelby versus Holder, and the kind of reversals that we can think happened to voting rights in that time. You know this governor. You have a way of understanding politics that I think is helpful for activists, helpful for grassroots organizers, movement builders. You know that we are in the middle of a desegregation fight that we believe needs to happen legislatively and not just in the judiciary. You know that our executive is reluctant, is demonstrating some rabid inaction on this issue. From a political perspective, right? From a political perspective, what do you think we can do as faith folk, from a political perspective, as activists, as students? What can we do to really impact the political calculus that seemingly the governor is taking or not taking?
Well, first, I think that it's important to know that, power concedes nothing, right? Like that one of the most powerful books that I've read in the last couple of years is a book by Angela Davis called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, right? And just the title of that book is amazing in that I think we forget that. We forget that, like, this is not a race to be won. It is constantly going. And the moment that you think that you won it and you let your foot off the gas, here comes another thing that sends you back. And unless you approach it as a constant struggle, you continue to have this problem. And the other thing is sort of educating folk, right? And that education includes making sure people understand your power. Look, politics is not a place for the courageous. People who are in politics, politics by its nature is trying to find, what can I do that doesn't upset the most amount of people? And so the road for a politician that is most clear is the one that makes as many people happy as possible. Courageousness and righteousness sometimes says you got to do what's right, even if it's not popular, right? And so that's different from politics. So, this governor is a friend of mine. This governor is a good guy, but we have to disagree where we have to disagree, and we have to force righteousness, because righteousness is hard. Politics is easy, because typically politics follows the path of the people of the majority. And sometimes what's right may not be accepted by the majority. And a lot of times, politics hides its hand. So even though you might be the majority, righteousness might be the majority.
Sure.
If you don't know that, if you're unaware of your own power, you still won't achieve what you're supposed to achieve. And I think a lot of that happens all the time. Congresswoman Watson Coleman represents a 67% white district. And people often wonder where her courage comes from. One, her approach is basically, I will do what I think is right. And if you can beat me, you would, and you should, right? And I think that there's very few politicians that approach it that way. But the truth of the matter is, if you can master the politics and do the things that you're supposed to, it gives you the freedom to embrace righteousness. And so if you really want to play this game, then you got to get good at registering voters, notifying voters, staying in touch with voters, recognizing that most of the power that you have in politics comes from your ability to motivate voters when it's not an election year, when it's not your time on the ballot, having a relationship with people all year long, making sure that people are educated about issues and know how to be activated at a drop of a dime. And when you have that level of power, you can make things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise.
No, thanks for that. Tiffany, you took on a pretty powerful establishment in New York City. You know, I want to ask you, what was that like? But I also want you to sort of voice over for us exactly what your entree into activist life was like as a student. And the reason why I bring this up as a student, because I know Michelle is a millennial on the younger side of the millennial. I'm sort of in that middle place of the millennial life. At 35, I am, I tell myself, when I talk to people Tiffany's age, you say, I'm not that much older than you. That's how you know you're old, when you start telling a college student, I'm not that much older than you, right? But clearly, I am closer to King's death age than the age he was when he entered the movement in Montgomery. So like, talk to us about what does it mean? What did it mean? What did it feel like to be a high school student, really challenging? I mean, not necessarily a popular mayor. I mean, he wasn't necessarily popular, but mayor of New York is a pretty powerful person, right? What I want to know how that felt, but I also want to give the audience some indications on what actually took place.
For sure. I remember it took me a while to believe that it actually happened after it happened. So I, at least like leading up to the phone call, I mean, I guess just for context, I had called into the Brian Lair show, and I remember from my application, from all my like college applications, I described it as I challenged New York City's mayor on his educational policy record. But it definitely, there were multiple, we were all calling into the show trying to figure out. So like, I didn't really have a plan going in. I didn't think I was going to get through because I had already called multiple times. I think I called like maybe like 8 times the first time that I actually got through. And so when I spoke to the person, I thought that it was just like a process. I didn't think that it meant that I was next in queue. Like, I thought it was just like, okay, I got in to the queue to get into like another queue. I thought it was just like a back-to-back process, but I didn't know that I was about to be on air. I was so confused. I was in shock. I was like, okay. And I remember I was texting like the Teen State Charge group chat, and then they're like, that means like you're about to go on. And I was like, what do you mean? What am I gonna say? I knew what I was gonna say, but in that moment, I just blanked. Like, I didn't know. I was like, okay, so I'm just gonna talk to the mayor, like on air. Like, is this a thing that students do? And it wasn't, definitely wasn't. But then I got through to the call, and then I just kept going. Luckily, like I had some notes with me. So like I knew what we were like, I knew what I should say once I got through onto the line. But again, because I didn't process that it was actually happening, and I didn't think that it was going to happen. When it did, I think like a lot of what I said just kind of came out organically at one point. But I definitely, it was shocking. I was nervous as well, because just I was still a junior in high school. I had never in my life like spoken to anyone in the DOE that wasn't a teacher or someone in my school. I had seen the superintendent in passing when like they come to do school visits, but like I never imagined that I would be speaking to anyone about like my experience in education, even much less challenging the mayor on what he was doing to improve our education, or what he wasn't doing actually. And so it definitely was a life-changing experience, just because it kind of showed me that you don't have to work within the DOE, and like you don't have to have You don't have to have a PhD in education or in any education policy. You don't have to necessarily have all of these accolades for your experiences to matter. And that kind of like guided my journey in activism and like my time through Teen State Charge, even after that happened, and also through the second phone call. The second phone call, I said he got a little frustrated with me that time around. But I think that like leading up to the phone call, aside from that aspect of things, just the work that we were doing, it was definitely guided by both my experience in SEO and also the students that I went to school with, because I was suddenly like thrust into this new like New York City activist scene. I realized that it was definitely a different I'm not sure what word to use to describe this, but it was a different vibe than I think most of the students that I went to school with were used to. A lot of the other like student activists that I met had kind of been like involved for a while, and like they went to schools where they were like advocating for other people and not really advocating for themselves. And so like when I would go to school and I would talk about like all of the things that we were doing, all of the events that we were hosting, like public events and informational events, for people to like understand segregation in the city, and like telling them about our experiences and how the things that we were lacking in our schools and the things that we saw other students had that like we didn't have. When I would take that back to my school, I realized that a lot of students didn't know that their experiences were different, one, and like two, if they did know, they didn't think that they had a voice, they didn't think that their perspective mattered, because every other student in our school had the same experience. So it's just like, at this point, that's just the way life is. I think that that's what really guided my experience through TTC and like kept me going, even in times where I was like frustrated and things weren't changing, or even in times where like I wasn't sure we were really making an impact. I realized that there were a lot of students that like when I told them what we were doing, or when I brought them back to Teen State Charge, or when they had the platform and they had the opportunity to speak about what their experience was and what they wish they had versus what they were afforded, I realized that once students start to believe in themselves, like once students start to believe that their experiences were valid, and that there's an opportunity to change that for everyone else behind them, it kind of made the work like a lot easier, and it kind of like removed the stress of like, okay, well, I'm talking to this person, or I have to have a script for like me for this meeting with like the education chair or with the chancellor. It made it so that I focused on not like the technicality of this, or not like the professionalism, or not like the actual situation itself, but on the reason and like the fact that I was worth it enough, and like my experience was worth it enough to be there in the first place.
Thank you for that. Michelle, you're a policy person. You're a policy thinker. And you've been waging a lot of fight. You've been putting a lot of fodder into anti-secession work around the country, desegregation work around the country. I'm sure there are people who tell you, oh, segregation is a thing of the past. People live where they live now out of choice, right? It's the myth of choice. What I often call is sort of social naturalism. People, you know, of course, Black people just want to live around Black people. White people just want to live around white people. People go to school based on where they live, right? I'm sure you get a lot of that. Can you help us really understand the current nature of segregation and why it is still a fight that we have to be engaged in when the signs have been taken down, when the water fountains are now integrated, and schools are no longer white only schools, Black only schools, according by the former metrics. Why is this something? What is it, and why is it something we should still engage?
Yeah, I would say for those who think that segregation is a thing of the past, we have to just turn on the news. We have to just turn on the news and see, why is there so much bias when we're trying to appoint a Black woman as a Supreme Court justice? Why are we still fighting over voting rights? And we were recently not recognized as citizens by a federal elected official. Why are we still debating issues of racism just literally 2 years ago with the death and murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, And why are we still living in a segregated country? I think when we look at the current state of segregation, we have to look at the data. We find that even particularly people of color, even if you have a degree, particularly Black people who have a degree, they tend to still live in segregated areas that are comparable to someone who is white who may only have a high school diploma. And so with that, we have to look at the bias, and we have to be very systemic about it, and we have to be very transparent about it. Until we can eliminate bias, and until we can talk about who we are as a collective people, and what does this mean for disaggregating racism for Black people, racism for working class white people, racism for Latino people, we will never find solutions. If we look at segregation, all we have to do is read our newspaper, look at the news. It is not by accident that we saw that predominantly communities of color, particularly those who are essential workers, suffered the most deaths and hospitalizations because of COVID-19. That is due to a lack of robust healthcare and education policies that have pervaded. All the pandemic showed was just an exacerbation of the impacts of segregation that we have been going through for decades. We also have to see that even though legally we cannot say that Black people cannot live here or working class whites cannot live here, we can use different coded language. So now, for example, we have zoning language that says those who make under $300,000, we really don't want them living here. Or if you're going to build, let's say, a multi-complex apartment, we don't want you living here. That is coded language for saying we really don't want a Black person living here. We really don't want a Latino person living here. So we also have to break down what this language means on a legal standpoint. And we don't have to, I'm not saying we have to study the law, but we have to know what this means in a coded way and how that perpetuates systemic racism and systemic poverty. If we look at the data, we still have a quarter of white students who have never gone to school with a Black student. The same is true for Black students. We still have almost 25% of Black students who are going to school where 90% of their students are Black. This does not happen by accident. School segregation and housing segregation, they go hand in hand. So as I mentioned, we may have seen racially restrictive covenants in 1917 and 1919, but now we see all this coded language that prevents us from being able to live and learn together. And as Thurgood Marshall said, we can't really learn together until we begin living together, and the same is vice versa. So when we look at the current state of segregation, there is no way that we can deny it, because if we could, there wouldn't be an issue with appointing now a Black woman Supreme Court justice. We still wouldn't be so polarized, especially here in DC and especially on Capitol Hill. And we truly would not have so many polarizing opinions on issues of race. For example, even the banning of critical race theory. And if we've seen in recent news, we've even seen suburban white women who are stepping up to the plate and saying, wait a minute, I read To Kill a Mockingbird in middle school. You can't ban this book. So even though we have people saying, we don't want you to teach critical race theory, all that is saying is that we don't want you to teach about racism, which means we don't want you to teach American history, because American racism is a part of American history. And until we can confront that past, and we have to do the self-reflective work, be aware of our own biases, we'll never be able to dismantle segregation. So it starts with us, and then it starts with fighting back through policy, through our voices, and through our activism.
No, I mean, you're right. Racism is the longest value in the story of America, the history of America. But yeah, I mean, and I want to hold on to that too. And you know, maybe we need to pick that up particularly at another session as we talk about the red herring of critical race theory, which is even being played out not just in places like Virginia, but being played out in our own legislature. We have Republicans presenting a legislation to ban critical race theory, although it's clear that critical race theory is not taught K-12, right? It's by and large not taught there. But good point. Tiffany, I think you can speak to this as well about why this is a fight we have to fight today, considering you were just fighting it in high school like not too long ago.
Yeah, I would say when I was in middle school, I applied to, I think you can apply to up to 8 high schools. And I applied to the max. I definitely applied to 8. And my first choice was not the high school that I ended up going to. My first choice was a high school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan called Eleanor Roosevelt High School. One of the things that like one of my counselors and even my parents, like my family, encouraged me to do in the high school search process was to find schools that had a majority of students that were white. And it's not because they wanted me to go to schools with white students necessarily because they wanted me to be surrounded by white people, but it's because they knew that that's where resources in the city were typically at. And they see my experiences in the schools that I've attended and resources that we were lacking at certain points. And that's just what I had searched for throughout the high school search process, was where the school's located, who attends these schools. And that's when I saw what resources were afforded. For those that don't know, in the high school, you're given a high school directory that is like 4,000 pages, and it has information of every single public high school in the city across all 5 boroughs. So I was looking, I went to school, I lived in Brooklyn, in Brownsville at the time. And well, I still live in Brownsville, but I had just moved there in seventh grade. So I was looking at schools in Manhattan because that's where they told me to look, or in areas like Dumbo and Park Slope in Brooklyn. So there, even though there was a high school that was a few blocks away from me, my zone school, that school had, I think, about a 30-something% graduation rate. And when I looked at schools that had 99 or 90 and above percent graduation rates, I had the most AP courses and sports and extracurricular activities offered. They were schools that were in more affluent neighborhoods, and they were typically zone schools, or they had screens. They either were academic screens, they required a portfolio, they required you to take an entrance exam or have an interview. All things that I didn't expect for myself at 13, which is how old I was when I was applying to high school. I didn't know what I would possibly put in a portfolio for anything. It wasn't even like art schools that were centered around like arts. Like it was just regular schools, like liberal arts high schools that were asking for portfolios and asking for interviews. I don't even know what I would say. Like I was 13 at this point. I had done nothing with my life but go home and go to school. And I didn't know what they expected me to say or do. But I definitely did not get into Eleanor Roosevelt. I met their academic requirements and their attendance requirements, which is what they looked at. And but they gave priority to students that live in the district, that live on the Upper East Side. And we all, like, who typically lives on the Upper East Side is who attended their school. And their school at the time, I think, well, I don't remember the statistics at the time, but right now I just looked it up. They are 2% Black and 7% Hispanic in a school system where 34% of students are Black and 47% of students are Hispanic. And so that just didn't quite make any sense to me. And so when I didn't get into the school, I ranked it as my first choice. And I didn't get in, so I ended up getting into my second choice. I was really disheartened because, like, even though on paper, like I should have gotten into the school, I knew the reason why I didn't get into school is because I lived in Brownsville. And like that in a school system that advertises like open choice for high schools, you realize like throughout time that that's not really the case. Because then I went to Pace and I realized like a lot of students had also applied to schools in other areas like Upper West Side or Upper East Side, or they applied to schools like Beacon, which is not that far from my school, but it's also majority white, and they require a portfolio and an interview in order for students to have the opportunity to get it, which doesn't make sense in a school system where a majority of schools are educational optional and don't require any type of screens. And so you have to look at like most of the schools that have screens have a majority of certain demographic that attends that school. So majority of schools that have screens are a majority white and Asian. And I realized that like in my time throughout Teen Take Charge, when a lot of the students in the organization that were white and Asian did attend the schools that I didn't have the opportunity to get into. And a lot of schools the students that were Black and Hispanic attended schools where we had to fight for any opportunity, or we had to fight for like what we wanted. So like that what Michelle was saying kind of just reminded me of like my experiences in applying to high school and all of the things that I realized like I missed out on when I started to meet people that attended the schools that I had tried to get into, thinking that there were other reasons why I didn't get in. But like academically, I was kind of like academically I had matched what the schools were looking for, but in terms of like everything else that I couldn't change about like where I lived or about who I was as a person, that kind of hindered me in ways that I didn't understand, like before I realized, like before I had joined SEO or before I had joined Teen Take Charge.
Brother James, similar type of question, and you can answer it in the way they have as well. But as someone who is a political strategist, as somebody who does campaigns, and maybe not exclusively for Democrats, maybe not. I have a particular assumption that maybe you do, but I don't. I'll let you voice that over. But as somebody who has worked, gotten Democrats elected. You were in governance with the Democrat Bonnie Watson Coleman. I want to ask a question to similar to this, a derivative of this, and I want to be clear. I'm making a correlation. I'm not making an argument of causation. So this is not a causative claim. It's more of a correlative claim, right? What we find is that New York State, Democratic state, is the most segregated in terms of public education. California, another Democratic state, is number 2. Maryland, Illinois, Maryland is unique to some extent, right? But pretty much Democratic strongholds. New Jersey is number 6, Democratic stronghold. Why are we seeing that the top 4 of the top 5 states for concentrated racial and class segregation in our schools are in Democratic states? Like, is there an opportunity there that we could push something in another direction? I'm not a GOP guy by any stretch of the imagination. I'm left, but that's why I want to say this is a correlative argument and not a causative argument. I don't think Democrats are responsible for this, but I do want to know, why is this the case, right? Since it is the case, why can't we find remediation from Dems?
Mostly because housing discrimination and protecting property values is a white racism thing, not a party thing. And the actions of white Democrats and white Republicans and some rich minorities agree when it comes to housing discrimination. And if we can't, and one of the things that I want to talk about that sort of meets with what Tiffany said and what Michelle said, is that one of the things that we can't fight some of this stuff is because we don't know the history. Critical race theory reminds us that we have to educate people. Sister Tiffany was talking about a lot of things, and for her it was new, but she's talking an old fight, a fight that's been fought already. And I almost want, and we had it in the office, in the congressional office I worked for, I created a what I called the bloodstained banner. I created a mission statement, and in that mission statement was all these things that we believed that we had to fight for. And it's almost like we have to grab a mission statement for every Black person that goes into politics or public policy. One of the things that drove me crazy in Congress was that there's a bunch of Black people who come from the Black Ivies, Morehouse, Spelman, Howard, FAMU, and they want to be on Capitol Hill, and they want to wear the suit, and they want to go to the meeting, and they want to sit behind the congressman in the committee room. But if you ask them about why you're there and what are the issues you're fighting for, they have no clue. They don't know nothing. They just want to be there, and they want to work for a Black member. That's not enough. You've got to commit to yourself to kill segregation. You got to commit to not allow the monetization of justice. So you can't allow people to lock people up in order to make money. You can't believe in payday lending or anything that's like payday lending. Like, we've got to have a series of things that we are fighting for that is consistent and that is intrinsically linked to our history. And having known our history, you know that, like, my grandfather's from Richmond, Virginia. He was in World War II. And when he came back, half his platoon was white and half of them was Black. But the Black half was not eligible for the GI Bill. And so the white half got houses. So my grandfather went and got a job, a great job, worked really hard, and he sold cone liquor on the side, and he got a big old house. But Black people couldn't even buy a house in the white section. So even though he had a house big enough to have a beauty salon where it would be the garage, and they prospered based on Black people's prospering, the land that he bought, that he was forced to buy on, was not as valuable as the land his white counterparts. Not only did they get help to buy it, they could buy it in a place that those houses would maintain values for years. So when my grandparents got sick and they moved out of that big house, all the money that we got out of that went to take care of them. There's some white boy somewhere who still his house in 2021 is financed by the wealth created by the house his grandfather bought in the rich section of Richmond. That's now worth millions of dollars. But we didn't even have that option. And the continual redlining of people, the continual not accessing mortgage continues to have an impact on our wealth. And if you are working in politics, and if you are voting for people, and if you are going into politics and you don't know the relationship between what you should be doing in politics and that story, we're at a disadvantage. I just learned last week, I listened to old sermons, and I listened to an old sermon by a guy by the name of Sam Proctor, one of the great preachers of the world. And Sam Proctor told a story about a Black preacher named Culver, that he wanted to start a school, a university that ended up becoming Virginia Union University. So he flew out to California in 1904, and he heard about a white man who was giving out money to Stanford University to start a school. And that same white man gave him $10,000. He came back and started Virginia Union. But the problem was he couldn't find a building. Nobody would give him a building because they didn't want to have a Black school started, except one Black man who was a relative of Robert Lumpkin. Robert Lumpkin had a prison for runaway slaves. Man, that thing was a great sermon. Robert Lumpkin's job was to capture slaves that refused to be slaves, like they were trying to run away. And he treated them so badly, he charged their slave owners rent after he captured them. And when you come get your slave, you have to pay me in order to get it. And he did that for years, from 18 something until 1866. And his family was embarrassed that they had the slave jail. And they were the only people in Richmond that would give a building to Culver to start a school. And that's how they started Virginia Union. And what I learned from that story is that there was a Black man who knew that he was going to do something. He knew that he wasn't going to be there when a graduate student crossed the stage of Virginia Union, but he planned in his mind that I'm gonna plant a tree that my face won't be covered with the shade that it creates. We got rappers now that buy Bugattis, don't give a dime to a Black college. None of the things that they spend or wear around their neck or put on their teeth will benefit generations that they don't see. We got to figure out how we educate people so they understand that something you do today has to impact what's going to happen tomorrow. What's going to happen to that Bugatti that you have with the white woman that you marry when you die? What's going to happen with them teeth that only fit your teeth with them diamonds in it? Where is the Culvers of the world? Where's the Reverend Culvers that's trying to figure out how we change this public policy and how we make a difference that will hit people, that won't bring shade on our face, but will grow tall to provide shade for our ancestors? That's a problem. We don't know enough, and we ain't got the right substance inside of our ancestors that said, I just left slavery. Slavery started in 1865. Culver was starting this in 1866. How the hell he knew what was going to happen? He didn't know where that was going to end up, but he said, I'm going to start a college because I know one day there's going to be a Tiffany, there's going to be a Michelle, there's going to be a Francois, and they're going to get PhDs. He saw that without seeing it. And your dumb butt buying $1 million tooth and a car that'll be worth nothing in 10 years. And no child will be educated because of your Bugatti. We got to change how we think about this thing and why we go into politics.
No, thank you. Thank you. I love that. I love that so much. And the Proctor reference is so appropriate. On the first night of this experience, we had the Reverend Dr. Virgil Wood, who was a mentee of Proctor, and also a native of Virginia, and a graduate of Virginia Union University, actually. And then
I'm glad
last
I
week,
didn't know that story. I would have been at Virginia Union. If I knew that story when I was 18, I would have went to Virginia Union too, because I would have said, I need to be where the runaway slaves were.
yes, sir. No, I hear that.
Where they
And
were.
and then last week we actually had one of the he's a scholar in New York, but he's a deacon of the Abyssinian Church where Proctor pastored for a little over 15 years while he was also teaching.
Really quick. I don't want to dominate time, but I was deciding between Dartmouth, the University of New York at Albany, and Morehouse. And a guy named Buster Sores came to me and said, hey, I want to take you to meet this old preacher. And he took me to see Sam Proctor. He convinced me to go to Morehouse. I had no idea who Sam Proctor was.
Wow.
Like, I didn't know who Sam Proctor was until years later.
Wow.
That this little old man that was trying to tell me that Martin King became Martin King because he went to Morehouse, and that I should throw away everything else and go to this little school in Atlanta because it's so great. And I had no idea. Buster Stories, I still talk about that. It was February. I hadn't made a decision. I've been in accepted to all the schools, but I hadn't made a decision. And Buster said, I'm tired of talking to you about it. I'm gonna take you to meet this guy. And that's how I ended up at Morehouse.
Wow.
Because of Sam Proctor. Yeah.
Wow. Monday was the Founders Day, 155th Founders Day of Morehouse College. So so appreciate you.
Valentine's Day, but we say Founders Day.
Founders Day, bringing that story in. Listen, we're gonna close this out. We're talking about pastors. I mean, I think Proctor has had an outsized influence on American policy. We don't talk about it enough. On American higher education, we don't talk about that enough. Michelle, you know, we have at least two pastors on here today. We have the Bishop Hargrove, who's the pastor of the fellowship, who's the president of the Fellowship of Churches here in Atlantic County. We have Pastor Bill Rutherford, pastor in North Jersey, who is also a city council person, building his own power, and we all have influence over other preachers. What could clergy persons add to this fight? You're a policy person. What do you need clergy to do that will make your job easier?
Yes. Well, I'll first say that Brother G took us to church, and we can drop the mic, but I'll add just a little bit to that. I will say pastors make a huge difference. Pastors are imperative. Members of the clergy are imperative. Why? Because you have congregations, parishioners that may range from 20 to 20,000 members, and they listen to you. So they might not listen to the stranger who's telling them to go take the vaccine, but they'll listen to the pastor. They may not listen to the stranger, or maybe everyone is not reading the newspaper that talks about how to fight segregation, but they're going to listen to their pastor every Sunday say that, because pastors have had a huge influence, particularly on the Black community, since the days of enslavement. We know from our history that Sundays was used as that rest day, was used as that day to go to church, to learn more, and to listen particularly to your pastors. So pastors have an obligation, because the members of your clergy, just as you watch out for the souls, you also have to watch out for the minds, because your congregation listens to you. The influence is so big. It's not a mistake that when President Biden and when President Obama went to campaign, where do they go? They go to the churches, and they're going to go to the churches that has a congregation of 5 people or 2,000 people, because they know the influence that pastors have. Your congregation listens to you, and your congregation looks to you for inspiration. So when a pastor says, I'm going out here to vote, and you need to learn about this member who's running, and maybe we don't even know his name. Maybe he went to a school we don't even know about. Maybe he don't even look like us, but he is for us and he wants to help us. We need the pastors to tell us that, because the pastors are the pastors are our gateway to that knowledge. And we look to the pastor every Sunday for the word, for Bible study, the rabbis too, people of all faith. We look to our leaders to listen and to learn, just as Dr. King was also a reverend, just as Malcolm X was also a leader, particularly in the Islam community. We look to our leaders for that guidance and inspiration. And so it is important. I ask members of clergy, particularly pastors, to not work in silos, to work with those who are doing this work in education, work with those who are doing this work in voting rights, because we need you. We need that coalition building. I'm grateful now to be working in workforce development, and of all things in manufacturing, we're talking to the ministers, because it's the ministers who are telling the congregation, you need to go get this job. You may not even have a college degree, but guess what? you can make $60,000 a year just by going to this community college. And you know what, as your pastor, I'm going to walk you to register for that class. We need that motivation and we need that presence. So pastors play a huge role. And I ask pastors to please help members of clergy, help your congregation. If you see a fellow member of clergy is not doing anything, help, because this is all our role. This is part of our servant leadership, and we can't be a true servant leader if we are not helping others to better their lives as well as to better their souls. So I love working with pastors. I'm grateful to have a best friend who is a surgeon and also a preacher, and that's how we work together. That's how I learn about healthcare. That's how I learn about education, through members of clergy and through the congregation. It's the congregation who can make a difference. Now, say you don't have to be a leader to make a difference, but just by listening to your pastor and working in a coalition, joining in a committee, it takes all of us to do this work. So I also ask the attendees of this call, we need to come together, whether you're in church every Sunday or not, we need to come together to get in this fight. So thank you all for the opportunity, and thank you to the members of clergy on this call.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Tiffany had to run to another meeting that she was hosting, but this is the last question. I'm gonna allow my Morehouse brother to answer this question. We've been crunching the numbers, and we find out, contrary to what we largely think, is that the overwhelming majority of Black and Brown students are not in the central cities of our state. They're actually in our suburbs, which are too resegregating. You, Brother G, you have a particular political calculation about racially diverse suburbs and how Black people can build political power, not just in our central cities, like Atlantic City, great city, of course, Camden, or Trenton, or Newark, but how Black political leadership can actually come from these diverse suburbs, places like where the Congresswoman is from. Can you say a bit about the importance of that calculation that you're thinking, and what could that mean for the Black Legislative Caucus in this state if we really took seriously what you have in mind?
Well, first of all, the truth of the matter is that everywhere, all over America, Black people live where you don't expect them to. We live everywhere. And the other shock to the system is that we, African Americans in particular, we are very powerful politically because we vote, and we still ain't voting at the levels that we could. And the one thing that you can point to is that Obama showed. When Obama ran, people voted like they never voted before, and they haven't voted since. And so it makes sense that there would be a Black woman on the Supreme Court, because Black women have been so good to the Democratic Party and to voting for Black people. But there's a whole bunch of us who have yet to vote, and who never vote, and who miss the vote. And if we ever do the work that we should to make those people that we know in our communities that don't vote, the impact would be even greater. And so that's the first thing. But then if you look outside of the cities, just outside the cities is a great place. There are Black people who live there and they don't vote. Because I grew up in Atlantic City, when someone asks me when I'm in Newark, where are you from? You say I'm in Atlantic City, when in fact you live in Galloway Township or some other city near there. But you never say that city where you actually live. You always reference where you went to high school and where your mama and them lived. What we've got to do is to get people to vote right where they are, because regionally we have power. And one of the greatest assets that Black people have, and one of the biggest challenges for Black people, is that white people never think about us. And so the fact that they don't think about us, we often suffer. But politically, them not thinking about us can help us win stuff that we're not supposed to win. Because if we can gather and politically organize in areas that aren't normally places where we show power, we can win stuff that we weren't expected to. And how that looks is, there are places where the Democratic vote is what it is. And when a white person runs, they get the Democratic vote. And that Democratic vote might look like, 51% of the total vote, with Black people voting 16%. But when a Black person runs in that district, they will get the normal Democratic vote, and the Black turnout will shoot up to 95%. So the first time a Black person runs in a congressional district, if they can hold on to the normal Democratic vote and expand the turnout in the Black community, you can make something happen that never happened before. And for political guys, if you hired me in Ohio, if you dropped me in Utah, I'd do the same thing every time. I analyze who votes every time. I analyze what percentage of that vote is Black. And then I tell you who can win. Now, if I looked at the last 5 elections and everybody who votes all the time, 80% of them are white and 16 of them are Black, I'll tell you that we probably should have a white candidate. But if I had a Black candidate and I got 80% of the Democrats to vote and 94% of the Black people to vote, all of a sudden that candidate gets more votes than we've ever seen before. When Rush Holt was running for Congress, Black people voted between 12 and 13%. When Bonnie Watson Coleman, and he would win his election by 100 votes or 1,000 votes, the election would be very close. He'd win by 1% or 6%. In the same district, Bonnie Watson Coleman gets 94% of the Black vote, and she wins by 64%. When we started in that district, people said, if you win, you'll win by 1%. If you win, you'll win by 1 to 2%. We won by 64% because the Black vote went from 16% to almost 95%. And so I am suggesting that, one, Black people got to run for things that we don't think we can win. And two, we've got to organize, not with this, not like this. We got to organize like we used to do, door to door, chicken dinners, fish dinners, your mama and them and her mama and them, and churches. That's why churches are so important, because the church, if people are honest, you have a great connection of people who are important in church, but they're the leaders of your family. They ain't your whole family. You got a trifling cousin that's on the couch. You got an uncle that never go to church. And those are the people that make the difference. Big Mama and them always vote. But when Uncle Charlie, who don't want to miss the beginning of the game, votes, oh, it changes things. And we've got to organize in a way that Uncle Charlie and little cousin and Nene, and then we got to fight to make sure that you don't purge people from the voting rolls, and you allow people who have had a problem when they were 16 and 17 years old not to be purged because they're returning home from prison. We got to fight, do all those fights, and then we can have an electorate that looks like the state that we're in. Phil Murphy won his election this time because Black people voted. Whole bunch of white people decided they're going to pull the lever for somebody else. But he was able to hold on because the people that always vote in Trenton, and the people that always vote in Atlantic City, and the people that always vote in Newark, and the people that always vote in Jersey City, Black people, they voted for him. Yeah. And he's held it out. But when he got everybody to vote, because he was spending millions of dollars in the Black community, and Black people who were on the outskirts voted for him, he won by 14 points. And that's the difference. We've got to get our community organized, and we've got to organize it the way we used to. Facebook is not an organizing tool. Just to be clear. I feel so old, but I know from what I'm talking about. I got 50 of them under my belt.
Thank you so much, Brother G. Thank you so much, Sister Michelle. Thank you, Tiffany, for joining us tonight. We have one more week of this experience, and I'm really excited about next week. We have 3 scholars that are going to be with us. One of them is my favorite, Dr. Cashin, who has a phenomenal book around segregation. And so you want to be here next week. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be a great closeout, a great culminating moment for us. To the electeds who are with us today, Brother Nathan Parker, you've been with us each week. Happy to have you here, and looking forward to working with you as we move forward as well. I did see I thought I saw the executive director of Gamilio with us today. I can't go back through the chat, but thank you for being with us as well. There's a lot of good work for us to do in this state around desegregating our schools, to hopefully that it becomes the kind of bellwether that is necessary for us to make those changes in those other states where we have people that count us friends because we keep them in office, that they will move the needle there on their own segregative realities. We are using this time, these weeks, as a chance to give each of us an opportunity to sign on to a very important letter. We have said over and over again that our governor is living with a kind of rabid inaction, maybe indifference. I don't know. He won't talk to me. So I can know whether it's inaction, indifference, or whether he's just really being calculated and he has the answers. We have answers for him, but he has not met with our coalition, Building One America and New Jersey Coalition Against Racial Exclusion, our coalition. And so we have decided, since he won't listen to us, we know people he will listen to. And these are the big donors who got him, who fund his campaign, who fill the coffers of his work. And we know that he is going to be a pretty powerful governor. The New Jersey governor is already the most powerful gubernatorial seat in the states, but he will lead the Democratic Governors Association and also the American Governors Association. And so we know some of his friends, and I just know that his other Democratic friends and these Democratic donors would be so surprised that there's a governor that won't talk to Black and brown pastors and Black and brown civil rights leaders and Black and brown community leaders on the issue of segregation, considering he is the governor in the U.S. that boasts civil rights bona fides, a former member of the National Board of the NAACP, which will be meeting in our backyard in just a few months. And so we have a letter that we are sending to his supporters, letting them know that they can talk to him on our behalf. And we're looking forward to them getting in touch with him so that he will finally get in touch with our coalition and honor the meetings that he's actually promised us over these last several years, that he'll honor those meetings. And so you can find the link to that letter here in the chat. If you are authorized to sign on behalf of an organization, we greatly appreciate that. And if you are signing on as an individual, we also appreciate that just as much. And so as we close out, that is our call to action. We are going to talk to our governor's friends. We put him in, we voted him in office. Many of us voted him in office, and a lot of them paid for it. And so I think there's some mutual self-interest there to make sure that he's doing the best job that he can and honors his words. And so sign that letter for us, and we look forward to getting that out to him, to them, CCing him, so that we can finally have these consequential meetings on a real legislative agenda that can push this forward. This is not the time to hide behind. This is not the time to hide behind litigation, which is what he's currently doing. There is a lawsuit, Latino Action Network versus the state of New Jersey, which the hearings for that will actually start on March the 3rd. But this is not the time to hide behind litigation. He has the power to do a lot of what we're asking. And as the leader of this state's party, he can move the legislature, both chambers of the legislature, if he actually is invested in this work. So we're closing, and we look forward to seeing you all again on next week. Seeing you again next week. The Lord bless you and keep you is my prayer. Now unto you, O God, who's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we could ask or think, according to the power at work in us. To you, God, be glory, majesty, dominion today and forevermore. And everybody said amen.
Amen.
You all have a phenomenal evening. Thank you all for being here. Looking forward to being in your virtual presence next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for being here.